Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today, and apologies that I'm joining remotely. Today, I'm going to be summarizing our first training session on the psychology of online negativity, the technology of these AI tools for hate detection, and the social dynamics that pull all these things together. So the first part of our training was done by Stuart Soroka, who's a professor at UCLA, and he laid the psychological foundation. The idea that humans are essentially wired to pay more attention to negative content more than positive content. And that's something that shows up in psychological experiments across multiple countries. It shows up in the patterns of how we consume our news. It even shows up in what we click on, even when we say that we prefer to watch more positive content, right? But here's the thing, the message that Stuart was telling is that this is actually something that predates social media. Like this bias that human beings have for negativity is something that happened even before Facebook and social media started leveraging it. But what social media does is that it exploits this bias and it amplifies it with these algorithms. And so the idea for him is that it also points us in a promising direction for how to address it. Because one finding in the literature is that online interactions, the more they become more personal, the content sends a trend positive, right? And so this idea that we can essentially use the same mechanisms that pull people towards negativity to see if we can promote positive content and pull people in the opposite direction. And our next presenter in our training was Sadia Gabriel, you'll see in the panel right after this one. And what Professor Gabriel showed us is why this automated moderation is necessary and how we can make it better. For starters, human moderators simply cannot keep up with the volume of hate and other inappropriate postings online, and the toll on humans to have to see this kind of content is actually severe. And so we need AI, and we need these AI tools. But what Sadia points out is that the current tools still fail in very predictable ways. They miss things like coded language. They even things like they carry racial bias from the data and the material that they're trained on. And importantly, the AI tools can't read context as well as a human being can. And so these off-the-shelf tools systematically underperform on content targeting, especially for these specific communities that might be targeted with hate in the first place. And for Sadia, the fix is a centerpiece of her research, and that's how to integrate community input into the technology. The training moderation systems at having annotators from the community essentially improve and help train the content moderation tools, improves accuracy meaningfully. The context doesn't just improve the processes of moderation, it's actually something that we can think about improving the underlying technology as well. And so where this all fits in is, Stuart starts with the psychology and the sort of negativity bias. That's the starting point for a lot of why hate takes hold. Sadia, of course, talks about the technology, why detection is hard and how we can make it better. And my piece is the social dimension. Why do people join communities of hate in the first place? What keeps them there? And what that implies for how we can address it. And so the key claim that I'm emphasizing in my part of the training is the idea that hate is social way before it's ideological. People join hate communities for things like belonging and validation and status. And in a lot of times, the hateful content is almost just performative. It's a signal for loyalty or a bid for recognition. Sometimes it's not even all that ideological. And so that also changes how we think about responses. If we think about content moderation and platform initiatives as something that's addressing the symptoms and the spread of hate, it addresses the output, but it doesn't address the underlying need that drives it to begin with. And so we want to think about it more like quarantine, slowing the spread, but then we also need tools to address the causes and underlying drive that people have to join these communities to begin with. And here, the relational approaches really shift the focus from individuals to communities. We want to think about what norms are there for, like how we want to relate to each other. We want to build ways that we can have alternative communities of belonging. We even want to see if there's ways to reduce the social rewards that can sustain hate expression. Right? If we can make it something that is uncool or uninteresting, then we're reducing the incentives of people to participate in those communities. We also have evidence that elements of this relational approach work across a number of different contexts. And the idea that looking forward, we can build interventions around these shared norms and community resilience to hate, rather than just thinking about it as an individual level problem all the time. And so, if we think about the all three lines of work, really point to the same type of layered response. Design platforms that redirect negativity bias. Like, how can we leverage the natural psychological tendencies of human beings? How can we leverage that towards more constructive engagement? Stewart points to things like increasing personalized interactions as one particular vehicle. For Sadia, the idea that we can build AI tools that can do this content moderation in a way that's both community informed and context aware, right? And then from my side of the presentation, investing in the social conditions that can make these hate ecosystems less attractive in the first place. We can think about them as working together, but at different levels of the same problem, and a way to, like a unified framework for thinking about how to make our programs and our interventions stronger. So some 3 things for us to think about today. If I can kick off our discussions with some things for everybody to keep in mind. The first is that negativity bias is a feature of human psychology, right? But it's not necessarily a platform glitch or something that social media created. And so what we want is to sort of think about it as something that's normal, and we design around it. And so we want to think about programs that create spaces for more interpersonal and more constructive engagement, because those are the things that can pull the mechanisms in the other direction towards more positive content. The second is that AI moderation is really only as good as the community context behind it. And here's where LA County has a lot of resources to be able to make this better. There's a lot of partnerships with community organizations. We've got dense, organized local knowledge, and creating these channels and mechanisms for community organizations and platform moderation efforts to work together doesn't just improve these processes, but it actually makes the technology work better. And third is investing in the offline communities, the social infrastructure of the online communities. People join these hate ecosystems to have community and validation and status. And actually, it's not primarily about ideology. And so programs that can shift these social norms and social rewards around how we can engage more productively and constructively with each other can actually reduce that pull in ways that can scale very easily through networks. So here, if we want to, like I said, we want to think about moderation as the quarantine. This is a way to address the problem on both ends, right? This idea that if we focus on community resilience, we can build towards something that's better and reduce that flow of hate that's going through the content moderation to begin with. And so essentially, the research across all these presentations points to a very simple theme in a way. The idea that these psychological and community context and social dimensions really point to a nice way forward or potential way forward. And that's the fact that the problem is social much more than it's technological in a lot of ways. And so our responses have to match in the same way. So thank you again. That is our summary of our training session, and I will hand it off to training teams 2 and 3.
Okay, my name is Christine Ong. I'm a researcher here in the School of Education and Information Studies and part of an oh, do I need to be closer? All right. And part of a study called SMASH, Social Media and the Spread of Hate, funded through the ISH initiative. And I had the pleasure with my colleagues, Catherine Heather, Josh Getz, of leading Training 2, which is about youth, social media, and identity-based hate and violence. So here we go. And through our session, through our session we asked a lot of questions. The first one being, to make sure we're on the same page, what do we mean by social media? Because there are a lot of different conceptions out there. So we followed the American Psychological Association definition, and they make clear that there are opportunities within social media to make connection, to build identity. So there are positives, but there are also potential risks, and that's what we're going to focus on. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. In their words, there are charms and harms for youth related to social media. And perhaps you have an adolescence at home or remember your own adolescence. It's a time of rapid growth. What Ceci said, the need for belonging, validation, those are very strong at this age. And combining that with social media and its features, it's complicated. So there are a whole host of risks that have been associated with youth and social media. This is somewhat comprehensive, but there's perhaps even more out there. Things like cyberbullying, self-harm, exposure to hate speech or extremist content, all sorts of things that have been connected in the research in different ways. So we're just taking a very broad brush and look into the field. One way to think about this and think about risk are different buckets. We talked about this. Some researchers have envisioned that there are kind of three broad buckets of risk. One relates to youth encountering hateful or inappropriate content. The other, that youth make contact or risky interactions out there, whether it be a predator or other misinformation, those types of things. And then finally, that youth engage in hateful and inappropriate conduct themselves. They're the cyberbully. They're the ones spreading the hate. Maybe they're the one taking up the challenge and not being able to resist their impulses. So we're really fortunate to have Catherine help us dig a little deeper and do a case study of what it feels like, sounds like, looks like to be on social media. From the SMASH work, we know we survey students, or students answer questions within school assemblies about their social media use. So we know from them that upwards of 78% say that they spend or report spending 3 hours or more on social media a day. That's a lot of time. What does it look like? Even if I'm on TikTok, my TikTok might look very different than some of the youth opportunities. So, and Catherine made clear that social media and TikTok, different platforms like TikTok, have certain affordances or ways that they engage. And so if we think about TikTok in particular, it's multimodal. So there are sounds, images, symbols, text, talk, all sorts of things mixed together. And it's really quite powerful, engaging, and also allows for hate to spread pretty quickly. So she gave some examples, and we can talk about this more later on today. But for example, there are implicit or coded references to hate. If you watch the video, you'll be able to see these examples in real time. But ways that codes, whether it be symbols or even songs, might connect to something like, for instance, the song Erica and anti-Semitic content. Not everyone will know it. It might elude content moderation, but the message is being sent. Then there are more direct or explicit examples, and one being, she gave the example of a Kanye West song that glorified Hitler, and even though the song was removed fairly quickly, the vibe was really catchy, and so it's been spread millions of times, added as a layer onto other videos, reels, things that people are able to send out, so it's very hard to stop. We also asked the question or wondered, well, how often or what's the prevalence of encountering some of these risks and harms? And again, we're high up in the sky, giving some very broad trends. And what are youth talking about, or what do they say? Oh, ooh, I forgot something here. So one thing I wanted to say is that, just to throw out some examples, in general, youth are reporting that they're encountering hateful content pretty regularly. From the SMASH study, 8 in 10 say they've seen hate speech in the last month. The Pew research study found that nearly half had reported being cyberbullied, and 1 in 5 teens ages, I think 12 to 17 in the UK, had experienced sextortion. In that example, and we talked about that during the presentation, a sizable number had never told anyone. They were too embarrassed. And especially girls, transgender youth, were more likely to be targeted. So again, there are certain trends within the research. If we look across studies, there are different methodologies, samples, approaches, definitions, but there are some very broad trends. There's a paintbrush there because we're brushing along the high lines of different characteristics that may make youth more vulnerable, or a combination of characteristics, whether it be something about their identity, it might be how they regulate emotions, and their maturity, neurodiversity, their feelings of social isolation. So a whole host of studies there to examine. And of course, there are features. If you've been watching the news, how social media is built and how these features might exacerbate or continue to keep kids locked into the screens is a big question. And then we had Josh talk a little bit about prevention and intervention. What do we know? And he's come up with this wonderful typology, which I think is very helpful to think about. So interventions can target the vendors, those people who are creating or posting hateful or inappropriate content, the vectors, how it's transmitted and amplified, the victims, those who are targeted, or the viewers, observers. And if we think about those, there are a range of prevention, intervention strategies out there in the literature. The caveat is this, or there are a few caveats. First, a lot of the literature and studies, interventions out there relate more to an adult audience. A lot of this work comes from different parts of the world. We don't necessarily know a lot about the implementation of these interventions, which is really important to understand. How does it work on the ground? And so with those caveats in mind, there's still a lot of different ideas and strategies that are both being incorporated and we can learn from, with probably starting with or thinking about some that have more of a modest strength of an evidence base, oh gosh, I've just misinformation or discounting misinformation. And there are some others that are really just in their infancy, like the age restrictions. There's some promising studies out there, but there's much, much more to learn. And what I haven't said, and I should, is that there's just a lot more to learn in general around youth and encountering risk and impact. We need a lot more longitudinal and causal studies. And so with that, a few key takeaways, and then some words of hope. So just to sum up, there's a words of hope. I know here's some trouble. There's a growing body of evidence connecting social media, risks and harms, and more research is needed to understand how and under what circumstances these risks are exacerbated. And as Catherine's work showed very clearly, that hate and discrimination are also often embedded, woven in to everyday aesthetics of social media. Sometimes it can be subtle, we might even miss it, becoming normalized and easily overlooked. And here's an important point as we think about interventions, we'll talk about that perhaps later today, is that intervention should be designed with built-in, independent, rigorous evaluation to really examine how does it work, under what conditions, and that there are things that we want to invest in that we have evidence behind versus, well, it seems like it should be promising or it looks like it is. We're really wanting to build that evidence base. And I just want to say one more word of wisdom from Josh, and you can talk about it more, Josh, is that notion that thinking about these things can be quite heavy, but we do have some tools. There are strategies out there, and we don't necessarily have to rely on companies making these changes for us. So, all right.
All right, thanks so much, Christine. Can people hear me? It's always hard to adjust the height and whatnot. Also, I wish I could tell you this Band-Aid comes from a back alley fight with the forces of hate. It's not. I cut myself shaving, so sorry about that. Anyway, my name is Howard Padua. I'm a researcher in the Department of Psychiatry here at UCLA. My research focuses on homelessness and addiction services. And I got into this project looking at hatred directed at people experiencing homelessness. And something that's notable, thinking about what Christine just said, is about how the technology changes, and it's kind of a game of whack-a-mole. And it makes me reflect back in, I think it was 2018, I heard a story on the radio about this strange thing called TikTok, and how they said, oh, this is coming, and this is the new thing that the kids are on. And I was like, and then I looked at it, and I was like, who on earth could watch this crap? And here we are 8 years later, and it's the world. So I think it's something to keep in mind that as we think about these platforms, it's ever changing. So in addition to keeping up with the technology, the surveillance, et cetera, we also need to think about how we approach these issues. With that said, I had the privilege of presenting with Dr. Fessler, Dr. Luft, and Dr. Panofsky, all of whom are here. My apologies in advance if I misrepresent or get anything wrong in my summary, but we are lucky to have them here so we can correct anything if we need to. So, first of all, why do we hate? I know, easy question, right? So, first of all, it's important to remember that hate, while we don't like it, it is natural. If you look at most species, Dr. Fessler, as an anthropologist, can tell us, cooperation with non-kin is pretty rare, but it's ubiquitous in humans. So we're really much more the exception in nature than the norm. And the reasons for this is, we needed it for survival. So it's important to keep this in mind just when we think of hatred and thinking about not liking the outer group. There are strong natural forces that kind of wire us this way. Thinking about what it was like when we were hunter-gatherers, we were much more likely to survive if we cooperated. It's beneficial to have allies, so that's why we have the kind of society we have. But the flip side of having an in is it also means you have to have an outside. To be one of us, there also has to be some who are not us. So if we think about this, we're certainly strongly motivated to belong to a group, but a lot of what it means to belong to a group means to have a heightened sense of who does not belong, who is not one of us. And often that could lead to perceived conflict, sense that there's an opposition of interest with that. And the mechanisms that can be activated by this are very real, evolutionary. Think about fear of heights, fear of snakes, fear of spiders. I myself am having tremendous anxiety looking at the spider on the screen right now because of how I've evolved. So understanding that these are certain things in the way we're hardwired that kind of emphasize when we have these negative feelings or feelings of fear. And it's particularly when we think about the risk of a false positive versus a false negative. So for example, when you hear a smoke alarm, you could say, it's just a smoke alarm, I can take it. But we also know that we don't want to die in a fire, so we're more likely to go outside. Similarly, we tend to emphasize and believe more and act on the fear of the negative. So how can hate go beyond just emotions? And this is where Dr. Luft's work comes in. A few things to keep in mind, because I think we often have these cartoonish understandings of hate and identity, what it is based on, extreme hate groups and things like that. But one thing to think about is that extremists really are in the minority. Even if they claim to speak for everyone, they really, really are in the minority. So if you look even, for example, the Nazi Party at the height of its power never even had half the vote. It was more like a third of the vote. So understanding that while they claim to speak for everyone, the forces of hate often do not. We also know that participation in what we think of as hateful activity, particularly in the form of violence, doesn't necessarily align with hateful conviction or belief in these things. So this is Dr. Luff's amazing work that she's done on the Rwanda genocide. A lot of things can lead to what we would think of as hateful action as manifested by violence that aren't necessarily deep-seated hate per se. Things like economic inequality, top-down pressure, social pressure, cognitive adaptation. All of these things lead to me perhaps deciding to participate in what would look like a hate-based activity or not. And also, these same factors, the same way that they can cause hate, can also be mitigated to reduce the likelihood of it. And this gets to the question of how do we counter hate? So this is where we look at some of Aaron's work, which is really interesting, looking at beliefs of racial white supremacist extremists. One thing we often say is that truth is the way to do this, that it's the best medicine. And a lot of his work talks about, the idea of, if someone has a misconception of something, well, just debunk the myth. Tell them what's true, tell them what's not. It doesn't really work. There's a lot of rhetorical tools that people who are very well adept at these things, particularly if you think about conspiratorial theories. Obviously, you guys know about the Johnson file, right? No one does? I just made that up. But that's a rhetorical tool that I could use to make an argument in support of a conspiracy. So it's very hard to debunk these things in real life. Oh, and I apologize for the mixed up animation there. So often if you look at the universe of hate and the universe of conspiracy, it's bound up in these claims that it's a game of whack-a-mole we can't keep up with. So it's very hard to think about how do we deal with this then? Now I'm going to point the finger at myself being the kind of health guy. We talk about a public health approach to a lot of things. And here's just a reference to that. The American Public Health Association actually talking about using a public health approach to prevent and respond to hate-motivated behavior in the US. This leads to the question of what do we mean by public health? Does it mean that we view it like COVID? It's a contagion. It's something that's coming in. And what we need to do is we need surveillance and we need to isolate it. Or do we see it as a condition where, I apologize, my text boxes got a little messed up. Do we see it as an opportunistic condition, as something that thrives on weaknesses we have in a society? So speaking to Dr. Luff's point about how there are certain situations that will make hate manifest in the real world that otherwise we may not have. And a lot of what we see in kind of a theme throughout is that it seems much more promising to think about taking care of the soil in which hate can grow rather than trying to isolate and prevent it. So I think a lot of when we talk about we have to find this out, it's infiltrating our society. It brings up the image of we have to go and find the Nazis hidden among us. When in fact, maybe what we need to do is reinforce harden our society by making a better society so we aren't susceptible to these ideas. And this is where anyone here work in health or public health with the county? My people. So you will recognize the risk and protective factor framework. When you want to prevent an adverse event, you can say, okay, we're trying to prevent hate, we're trying to prevent homelessness, we're trying to prevent addiction. And you can go out and focus specifically on that. But the more effective way to do is to think about what is going to mitigate the risk and what is going to enhance the prevention. So if you think about in health, risk factors are things like having a bad diet, poor hygiene, lack of primary care. Protective factors that encourage health are things like an active lifestyle, having good knowledge of health and self-efficacy. So if we think about translating this to hate, what would it look like from all the research that we've just been talking about? Risk factors are emotional instability, perceived threat, and a hate permissive or encouraging environment. On the flip side, what can help? Social connection, as the kids call it, IRL, touching grass, being in real life. Empathy, and having safe and stable environments. Aaron had a really great example. This is the case of Adrian, born as Derek Black. Now, if you think about someone who's at risk for a hate group, this is the guy, or this is the person. His father, Donald Black, was the founder of Stormfront, one of the first and most notorious Nazi websites. And his godfather was this guy named David Duke. So he was really seen as the future of the white supremacist movement. Now, They didn't quarantine him. They didn't isolate him. They didn't shun him. So his book, where he talks about his experience, their response to being a virulent white nationalist was, hey, come to Shabbos dinner with a bunch of Jews. And it worked. Rather than calling him out, they called him in. Those who were discriminated against, their response was to reach out and invite me to dinner, to make connections, to demystify. Having space to have conversations that change beliefs. And it highlights the role that really, connection is the key. It's not ostracization. There's a saying in the addictions that the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. And I think that we see, and we, as a theme through a lot of this work, the opposite of hatred as well really can be connection. So what else can we do? Well, we can mitigate the risk factors. We strengthen the community and opportunities for real-life social interactions outside of digital spaces that, as we saw, tend to promote asocial or antisocial behavior. We develop civic and cultural infrastructure. And the good news is, who develops civic and cultural infrastructure? The county. The county are the people who do this. They have the capacity, they have the connections, and really it's what you all do. So what's the best way to fight hate? Is to do what you do as the county. And really a lot of what we can think of is just how we can help steer things in that direction a little more in a way informed by the research. So that's it for me, and I'll hand it back to Amalia.